Imagine driving down the East Coast today. You cross state lines, but things look pretty familiar. In the 1600s, traveling from the northern to the southern colonies felt less like a road trip and more like landing on different planets. Up in New England, strict religious rules meant almost everyone lived, thought, and worshipped the exact same way. But right in the middle, in places like Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, you found a massive mix of different languages, religions, and cultures, all living side by side. This image shows a very early sketch of what is now New York City. Back then, it was called New Amsterdam. The people who built this fort and these houses along the water were Dutch traders. They weren't trying to build a perfect religious community. They let anyone move in, as long as they could help turn a profit. Seeing how much wealth was flowing through this deep, naturally sheltered harbor, the English king decided he wanted the profits for himself. He sent a fleet of heavily armed warships to take the city. Outgunned, the Dutch surrendered without firing a single shot, and the English promptly renamed it New York. Because this middle region prioritized trading and making money over strict religious rules, it pulled in workers from all over Europe. You had people from France, Germany, and the Netherlands living right alongside Native Americans, making it the very first melting pot in America. The English king, Charles II, actually owed a massive financial debt to a man named William Penn. Instead of paying him back in gold, the king handed him an enormous slice of land in America to settle the tab. Penn belonged to a religious group called the Quakers. At the time, their beliefs were considered extreme. They believed you didn't need a priest to talk to God, that physical violence was always wrong, and that every single person on earth was completely equal. William Penn treated his new colony as a holy experiment to test these ideas in the real world. Instead of taking land by force, he sat down with Native American tribes, negotiated treaties, and paid them fairly for the land his settlers used. This map shows the middle colonies, and you'll see dense clusters of wheat appearing across the region. The soil here was incredibly rich, and the climate was perfectly suited for farming. They grew so much grain that this area quickly earned the nickname the breadbasket of America. Because the Quakers firmly believed all people were equal, they looked at the growing practice of human slavery and called it out as morally wrong. They became the very first organized group in America to demand an end to it. Good soil, peaceful trade, and a welcoming attitude toward outsiders turned Pennsylvania into a thriving, wealthy region. What kind of rules would you make if you were handed a giant piece of land to start your own town? Take a moment to pause the video and discuss it. Let's look at this historic map of the colonies. As we move down the coast from Maryland into Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, the climate warms up. The summers are long and humid, meaning you can farm almost every day of the year. Up north, families cleared small plots for survival, but down south, massive estates replaced them, stretching for thousands of acres. Instead of food, they grew cash crops, tobacco, rice, sugar, cotton, and indigo, to be loaded onto ships and sold for huge profits in Europe. The people running these estates were often wealthy English nobles. This is a portrait of George Calvert, also known as Lord Baltimore. He founded Maryland specifically to give English Catholics a safe place to live, where they wouldn't be punished by the official Church of England. To settle a land dispute between the Penn family and the Calvert family, two men drew an official border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. They marked it with stone obelisks like this one. It became known as the Mason-Dixon line, and it eventually served as the cultural boundary dividing the northern states from the southern ones. The British needed a way to protect the incredibly wealthy Carolina colonies from the Spanish military sitting next door in Florida, so they created Georgia to act as a physical shield. If the Spanish marched north, they'd have to fight through Georgia first. To populate this dangerous borderland, the English sent over people who owed money. Back in England, if you couldn't pay your debts, you went to a literal prison. Georgia gave these poor debtors a chance to start over. But across all these southern states, there was a glaring issue. You can't run a multi-thousand-acre farm by yourself. Planting and harvesting tough crops like tobacco in the sweltering heat required a staggering amount of grueling, back-breaking labor. At first, plantation owners paid poor Europeans to work for a set number of years in exchange for the boat ride over. But as the farms grew, the owners stopped hiring willing workers and turned to kidnapping. They began forcing enslaved Africans to do the work for no pay, with no hope of ever being free. All the beautiful mansions and intense wealth of the southern colonies relied entirely on this brutal system of forced labor. It created a society built on a deep inequality that would eventually tear the country apart. Take a moment to pause. Why do you think the southern geography led to a system that required so much more labor than the north? When we look back at early America, we usually hear about the wealthy men who signed the official rulebooks and claimed the land for England. But what were the women doing while the men were writing those colony agreements? In the very beginning, survival was a group project. To keep the settlements from starving, women worked out in the fields from sunrise to sunset, planting and harvesting crops right alongside the men. In some places, women actually had a surprising amount of independence. Back when New York was still New Amsterdam, Dutch laws allowed women to inherit their own property, sign contracts, and run their own independent businesses. Without that intense physical labor and the money generated by female-run businesses, the earliest settlements would have struggled to survive their very first years in America. But remember those English warships that sailed into New Amsterdam's harbor? When the English took over, they brought their own laws with them, and that meant women's economic freedom was immediately taken away. Under the strict English system, a married woman was legally forbidden from owning property. If a husband passed away, his farm didn't go to his wife. The law required it to be handed directly down to his sons. Even with the laws stacked against them, women managed the daily work that kept every village moving. They balanced the household money, produced almost all the clothing and supplies people used to survive, and often ran the family farms or shops when the men were away. It was an exhausting existence. In 1769, a woman named Mary Cooper sat down with her diary and wrote, "I am dirty and distressed, almost wearied to death." She noted that her life consisted of little else but hard labor and sorrow. They were denied the right to vote or own the land they stood on. Yet the relentless daily work of these women provided the labor and the stability that allowed these 13 wildly different colonies to grow. Based on everything we've talked about, if you had to move to one of the original 13 colonies, which region would you choose and why? Pause the video and discuss.